It's the Awesemo NFL Showdown live before lock. Got Sunday Night Football show presented by No House Advantage, Packers, Saints. Now, very exciting for me because, once again, I'm filling in for Emac hosting the show, and I was asked to host the show. They said, Greg, would you be able to do it on Sunday night again? And I said, on one condition, and that is I want my co-host to be Booger McFarland. And I was told that was not possible, but Kyle was available instead, and I said, all right, that's okay. I could deal with that. I could work with Kyle again. So Kyle, happy to have you on the program again.
Yeah, I could spout off really stupid things for the entirety of the show, and you would never know the difference.
Yeah, that would be terrific.
Talk about how we got to get get Aaron Jones in captain, not because he's a great player, but because he sets a mental tone for our captain spot. I think that's something Booger would say if he played Showdown. Yeah,
there would be a lot of like Kyle Juszczyk in the captain spot, the best player in the NFL. I'm pretty sure that we were 4 weeks or so into the season last year, and Booger called Kyle Juszczyk the MVP of the league.
Yes, I remember that. That was the thing.
So, yeah, I mean, that would be – but you're fine also. I mean, it's acceptable to have you instead of Booger McFarland. I would have enjoyed having Booger. Today's games, what were some of your hits and misses? Let's start with the good. What were the things that you were on today? And obviously, the slate's still going on, so we don't really know how it's going to end up. But what were your biggest hits of today's slate?
So I would say, first off, just being on the Bills game in general, both sides of it were phenomenal. And I don't think that was awfully surprising. Both teams were playing, the Bills especially, playing at a surprising pace. I'm not surprised that the Rams play fun football, but a little surprised and impressed with how Josh Allen and the Bills are playing. And I didn't get to watch the game, but I heard he made some kind of absurd mistakes. But fantasy points are fantasy points, man. And other than John Brown getting hurt in that game was just a smash. So I was on that. Early in the week, our ownership projection for Tyler Lockett was enormous. It was insane. And I was ready to full fade him. And I really pulled back on that. Our ownership projection you could probably still play him. So that brought me to a point where I could put him back into players I'm actually going to be with the field on. It's a good update to make because, oh boy, if I didn't have Tyler Lockett, it would be a rough week.
Yeah, Tyler Lockett was huge. He is definitely one of my hits of the day. He had he has 3 touchdowns, and I don't know how many receiving yards last I looked, but that is definitely one of the top plays you need to have. He was fairly popular also. I wish that we would have gotten that touchdown of DK Metcalf too, because some of my best lineups are, they're Russell Wilson, DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and running it back with one of the Cowboys receivers. And DK Metcalf, of course, had that 74-yard catch, and then he was celebrating a little bit too soon that had the ball knocked away from him at the 1-yard line, which would have been nice to have that. For me, Mike Davis was a pretty good contrarian play. He very involved in the pass game and the run game, kind of played the Christian McCaffrey role, which I think is something to take note of going forward, is that no McCaffrey in there, and he just played a ridiculous role in the passing game and the run game. I think he had something like 4 catches for 40 yards and 40 rushing yards in the first half. So he was good. In terms of misses for the slate, it's kind of hard to know if he was a huge miss, but Miles Sanders is a little disappointing. He was really chalky, and I kind of went with him. He wasn't terrible on DK, finished with about 15 DraftKings points at 6,400. Would have liked to have seen a little bit more out of him. I was really hoping that once we got to overtime, he was going to get the 100-yard bonus, and then would have really made him okay, he was an okay play. But just a little disappointing for him. Carson Wentz really sucked.
Oh my God, dude. I watched that whole game. Carson Wentz, his stat line probably doesn't even look as bad as just if you actually watched him. I think not a film grinder, but man, he did not look good. He was miserable on deep balls. He was pressured a lot, so maybe that is certainly a contributing factor. There was a ton of pressure on both sides of the ball in that game. So, sure, you can excuse some of that, but he also just was not accurate on his deep balls. He couldn't find anyone deep. He missed Miles Sanders wide open, 30 yards downfield. Sanders was lined up, I believe, out wide and just blew by. They had a mismatch in coverage. They had a linebacker, a slow linebacker on him. I don't know who it was. He blew by this linebacker, and Carson Wentz just bricked it. He whipped a wide open touchdown. I believe it was fairly late in the game too. They had many chances to win that game and didn't. They looked bad. Joe Burrow was fun, but still not great. He's a rookie. It's what's expected. Yeah, that was disappointing. Mike Davis, I'm surprised more people didn't see him as closer to a free square. It doesn't surprise me that he comes in and plays this pseudo Christian McCaffrey role. And what I think on DK, he was 5,100. I was well over the field on him, and it wasn't it wasn't like everyone viewed him as this free square. I thought he was kind of free money, so I felt confident in him. He was one of my hits of the day as well. misses. The Dak Prescott side of the Seattle game has not hit particularly at all. So I think Gallup scored maybe, but just Dak hasn't blown up, and you need a blow up in a GPP, so it didn't really matter, his game. So I had a lot of that side, didn't go well. John Brown gets injured. I had all the Eagles. I don't feel bad. Like, I don't think Goddard is like a process miss because he gets hurt and it is what it is. You might have to actually bake in some Deshaun Jackson injury risk whenever you play him at this point because the dude just cannot stay healthy. So that one, that's an outcome we could have seen. Dallas Goedert getting hurt just kind of sucked. And every tight end got hurt or just didn't play well in this slate. So it's not like having a bad tight end destroyed your lineups. Like, it didn't preclude you from min cashing. So it's not the worst to have a Dallas Goedert bust, but I'm certainly not happy about it.
All right, so let's talk about tonight's game, Sunday Night Football. Obviously, the big injury news, Davante Adams is out tonight. Kind of expected. He was ruled doubtful earlier in the week, but there was some possible news that made it seem like he might have been able to play. He was apparently really pushing hard to play, and then Adam Schefter had announced officially that he's not going to play. So with that in mind, how do you think this is going to impact the Packers? Obviously, he's massive for their offense. Do you think they're going to go to a more run-heavy scheme, or are they still going to pass and just go to some of the other guys like MVS and Allen Lazard, or do you think this just totally changes how they run?
No, I think they probably run a similar setup, but I would say most importantly, this basically turns Aaron Jones into Alvin Kamara. Last year we saw it for, I believe, 4 games, and it was 22 catches, 200 and ballpark 30 yards, and 3 scores in those 4 games. And he had like a fairly okay, for a running back, actually quite impressive 8 out of 3.2. So like, they moved him a little bit downfield as far as running backs go. And of course, he was still getting his full workload of rushing attempts. He really does look like a souped up Alvin Kamara whenever Davante Adams is out. I would say Marquez Valdez-Scantling, I think he led the team in receiving snaps last week, and he's also running a bit deeper routes, has a slightly higher ADOT, so his market share of air yards is a bit higher than Allen Lazard. Both these guys, I would say it's more of a 1A, 1B than Valdez-Scantling really separating himself. So that's probably where I'd go at receiver, at least where I think the targets will flow at receiver. Aaron Jones, and we should see some more Robert Tonyan, basically like an every down tight end. He was like basically attached at the hip to all of the best lineups in week 1 despite scoring a 0. Actually shows up in the box score last week with a better game. So he's probably a guy who continues to get involved. Maybe we see some double tight end with like a Jay Sternberger, but I would mostly just focus on Tonyan at tight end.
Any other injuries that really stick out for you? I mean, obviously, Davante Adams is the big one from a fantasy standpoint. And I didn't really think there was anything else, at least that's different. We have Michael Thomas out, but he's been out. So I don't really think too much else changes there from the Saints. But I guess we could talk about that too. Is what did you see from the Saints last week with Michael Thomas out? And how do you think that they'll run their offense, their passing game today? Are they going to make any adjustments, you think, from last week to this week? Or do you think it's going to be a lot of the same guys involved? And obviously last week we got a very heavy dose of Alvin Kamara. Drew Brees, not really somebody who's spreading the ball. The other thing also, Drew Brees, looking pretty washed. I mean, only a couple of weeks. I don't want to make any bold proclamations, but Drew Brees is somebody who we've seen really focus his targets on Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara over the last couple of years. And without Michael Thomas there, I mean, it was just so much Alvin Kamara. Do you expect to see more of the same today?
Yeah, that feels like just their bread and butter whenever Michael Thomas is going to be out, is just feed Alvin Kamara. I will say Tre'Quan Smith like very clearly ran as the number 1 as opposed to like speculated that Emmanuel Sanders could have played that role. I believe he led the team in receiving snaps, targets outside, like receiver targets, not Alvin Kamara targets, and air yards last week. And I think it was Deontay Harris actually got a decent amount of run as basically like the team's clear-cut number 3rd receiver. Emmanuel Sanders is quite disappointing, but he was on the field enough that it's fair to say he's obviously the number 2. Jared Cook, a guy who, as far as tight ends go, actually runs pretty far downfield. Like tight ends, generally, you think they have to probably get there with touchdowns or PPR points. He could get there with some chunk plays. So I'd say Tre'Quan Smith, the very obvious beneficiary outside of Alvin Kamara, who's going to get 8 to 10 targets in competitive games, which is absolutely insane. So I would say Tre'Quan Smith, the very obvious beneficiary. Much like Drew Brees, maybe Emmanuel Sanders just honestly doesn't have the juice. He basically hasn't had 1,000 yards. I think it's 3 or 4 years. He's been kind of relegated to a 1B or a 2 or even a 3 in his past few landing spots. He still has any player on a showdown slate has touchdown upside, but he's just not a guy that I'm awfully excited about. Tre'Quan Smith is a dude who we've seen him blow up before. It could happen again as the number 1 receiver. And like you said, though, Drew Brees, just we've seen in the past few years, he's done something really smart, which is I think he knows his limitations and he scales back his deep attempts. He's been injured a few times, and every time we see it, he comes back and he just plays well, but conservatively. It's now this year, I don't know. Even his short ball looks like it might be completely gone. You said it, it's a small sample, so let's not read into it too much, but just worth noting that if Drew Brees goes out and throws an interception, goes for 200 yards, don't be shocked. Like, that is in the range of outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I've written off Tom Brady, I don't know, 6 times over the last 10 years or something like that. So I know better than to just totally write somebody off. I will say that there are some alarming signs from Drew Brees. If I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, I will say this. No Michael Thomas last week, but it was also a road game. And we know that traditionally he's always played much better at home in the Dome. And this is a home game for the Saints. So I think that is some reason to think of a little bit of a turnaround for Drew Brees. How much of a weight do you put into that and that he's going to be playing at home tonight?
Yeah, for like most scenarios, home road isn't a huge factor, and it essentially will get cooked in to, like, you know, your point. Your projections are often, should be, at least good projections should be, factoring in, you know, touchdowns, which comes from the Vegas line. Like, unless you are making your own manual projections and saying you think something different happens, Drew Brees is going to be like scoring more points at home on average because home teams do have an advantage in the NFL. But for Brees, it is like more than just the average, like typically 2.5 to 3 points of spread juice. He is a vastly different player at home, and being indoors certainly helps. But I don't know, maybe there's just a sense of like travel being difficult for certain players. Also, you know, home favored, those things are certainly factors as well. And Brees will tend to be favored when he's at home. So for me, Brees is one of the few guys that I actually do really consciously think about that when he's at home. And it shows up in the offense too. We see it with guys like Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara, who generally do better at home as well. I would say it's not the biggest deal. There are more important factors to consider, but for Brees specifically, it does actually come up on the radar as something that matters more than most.
All right, so real quick here, we're going to talk about our sponsor of the show, No House Advantage, and then we're going to give you some props real quick. I'm going to say these are some of the props that are on No House Advantage, and you just tell me whether you like the over or the under, and then how it just relates to them overall as fantasy plays for the day. So No House Advantage, this is a different spin for daily fantasy sports as opposed to just playing the traditional contest like we have on DraftKings and FanDuel. This is peer-to-peer, and you make lineups based on props. So you get a bunch of props. You get to pick which ones you like. You put them on a scale of 1 to 5, and then based on the amount of confidence you have in them, if they hit, that's how many points you get. So different way, different approach to play DFS. You can download the app, No House Advantage. Your first deposit will be matched up to $20 in free play when you use the promo code Awesemo. Refer a friend and get $5 after their first deposit. Beat your friends, not the house. Win big with player props today. The other thing also is that we have projections for No House Advantage up on Awesemo.com. That's not really available anywhere else in the industry. So if you sign up with the Awesemo code and then you also join Awesemo, check out some of the projections we have there, you get a pretty big leg up on the field. So we've got some of the props here. I actually did a little due diligence before, got Jordan to send me some props ahead of time. So I'd be ready with questions for this time. Alvin Kamara, over under 70.5 rushing yards for tonight's game. Do you like the over or the under on Kamara?
I'm going to say under. I don't know if the Saints are going to be winning a ton. I would say maybe his whatever his receiving prop is more likely to be over. I guess I'll say under on that just because I think most of his usage, like I don't know if the Saints are going to win this game. So I would say more of his usage comes as a receiver. I'd be inclined to bet whatever his receiving game usage is on the over. I'm going to say under on the rushing yards though.
So you can pick only one prop per player, because that was something I did think at first. I asked Josh, I was like, well, can you just parlay the receptions with the yards? Because you get really good correlation there, but you actually can't do that. But 48.5 receiving yards for Kamara is his receiving yards total. I agree with you. I think that's probably more comfortable than over. When I gave you that number before, you said that you would be more inclined to bet the over on the receiving than the rushing. 48.5. Does that seem like a reasonable play to you?
Yeah, I'd honestly be jamming that over. Like, that seems low for the number one receiver on the Saints.
All right, and then we get to Aaron Rodgers. I know no Devontae Adams, but 250.5 passing yards for Aaron Rodgers. That seems like a low number from playing in a dome against the Saints in what could be a high-scoring game. Does that number seem a little bit low to you?
Yeah, I'd kind of fall there as well. The only way I don't think that like he comes close to that would essentially be a game where they just kind of beat up on the Saints early, which like could happen. Like they looked bad against the Raiders. So if the Saints don't play competitive, I would say that that's a scenario where maybe they can just sit on a lead and use their talented like cavalcade of running backs. If this game is competitive at all, though, right, Rodgers has to have a big game. So I'd say over.
All right, so we've got a lot of talk in the chat right now about Emmanuel Sanders because he was mentioned before. And a lot of people are pointing out that he scored 0 fantasy points last week. That is more than true. He scored 0 fantasy points last week. He did not have a good fantasy game, but that goes hand in hand with Drew Brees didn't have a good fantasy game. And it stands to reason if Drew Brees doesn't play well, Emmanuel Sanders isn't going to play well. We look at Sanders right now. He is projected for 25% ownership on DraftKings. On FanDuel, he's projected for about the same 21% ownership. So you mentioned Sanders before. What is it that you like about Sanders, and why do you expect to turn around on this in this game?
So he was on the field with Drew Brees, who is now at home. The game has a good total. I'm not absolutely in love with Sanders, but if he's going to be fairly written off, like his ownership is going to be pretty sustainably low as far as Showdown is concerned, he's a guy that he's going to be on the field with Drew Brees, which he was still like getting a ton of receiving snaps for this team. I think that's a fine like ownership to buy in him at. I don't love him as a player, and I'm not sure if the offense has the juice left, but I'm just playing ownership percentages, and that's quite a low percent for the number 2 receiver for Drew Brees.
Yeah, I think the other thing too is, I mean, look, Emmanuel Sanders is still a quality receiver. I mean, he was pretty good last year. He actually came back surprisingly well from a torn Achilles. Usually guys get Achilles and I just kind of assume they're dead. I'm starting to evaluate them differently, and then not to go cross sport or anything. I'm kind of interested to see how Kevin Durant plays in the NBA this year, because we haven't seen a torn Achilles in the NBA for a while. And I feel like it's not the same injury it was a while ago. The first guy who really came back successfully in the NFL that I can remember was Terrell Suggs, who not only tore his Achilles once, he tore his Achilles twice. He tore both his Achilles, came back and was still a decent player for a couple of years after that. We've seen Richard Sherman. He was a guy who went really undervalued in free agency after tearing his Achilles. He's come back and has become an elite cornerback. So I don't think this is quite the same injury it was before. Not that it's saying that it's a good thing if you tear your Achilles. It's not something that I think you're super likely to be the same guy you were before. But there was a point in time where you tore your Achilles and it was kind of career ending. Even if you made your way back, you were a shell of your former self. That's not really the case anymore. Sanders did play, like I said, reasonably well last year. Bounced around, was on a couple teams. He is in a very favorable situation with the Saints now. And if we're going to have this kind of narrative about him now, where, I mean, we're looking in the chat where you mentioned the name Torrey Smith and people are typing with all capital letters, 0 fantasy points last week. Emmanuel Sanders sucks. Emmanuel Sanders ruined my lineups last week. If that's the narrative around Emmanuel Sanders, then yeah, I'm a little more inclined to roster him, because not only is Michael Thomas out, not only is the narrative against him, he's cheap. He's $5,600 on DraftKings. His FanDuel price is at $10,000. That's a little bit more expensive. So I guess the other question then is, would you be willing to play Emmanuel Sanders in the captain spot? We currently have him projected for 3% ownership in the captain spot on DraftKings, basically non-existent on FanDuel in the captain spot, just because it's, different strategies. There's not really need there because you don't save money by rostering a cheaper guy in the captain spot.
Yeah, I don't think, like you said, I don't think there's any real need to go there on FanDuel. On DraftKings, I think it does make some sense. I wouldn't go too crazy with it because, one, you don't need to have much exposure to him to be over the field at captain. And two, I do think, and our projections kind of back this up, that the odds of either a quarterback or Alvin Kamara, Aaron Jones being the best play are particularly high. Like, these guys are incredible in that they can get it done both through the air and on the ground. And Aaron Rodgers, I don't know if I'm probably going to come in below the field on Drew Brees. At captain, Aaron Rodgers, I think, is probably more of a fair projection for his captain ownership. I don't think you need to look too far beyond guys like, Kamara, Jones for me, the quarterbacks as well, and the same on FanDuel, essentially that exact same list. And you could probably even feel more comfortable with both quarterbacks at the MVP spot on FanDuel. Not sure how deep you need to dive. I would still probably prefer Traquan Smith, and our captain ownership doesn't have like Smith garnering a ton of ownership. So I'd lean Smith if the ownership was, say, let's call it 10% on Traquan Smith. If people were really excited about jamming in the captain, I would definitely say flip the script and go Emmanuel Sanders. But you don't gain much leverage by flipping to what I would say is still, to me, a lesser play. You might like Traquan Smith less. I would say, based on what we saw last week, you have to give a slight edge to Traquan Smith. He's more expensive, though, but I do think he's probably worth the price. They both fall in a similar range to me, though.
Yeah, so for me, if I'm only picking one captain, if I'm playing one lineup, I think it's Alvin Kamara. He's going to be the most popular player in the captain spot according to our projections, but even so, I mean, our projections are showing him to smash the likelihood of him being the top play compared to his ownership. We have him projected for 22% ownership in the captain spot on DraftKings. His projected chance of being the top overall scoring player in the game, nearly 40%. And then something kind of similar on DraftKings, FanDuel, 18% captain ownership, and then projected 30% chance there to be the top scorer. Obviously, a little bit different scoring system there where the PPR isn't valued as highly. Therefore, the pass catchers are downgraded a little bit and the quarterbacks are upgraded. But so I just look at the disparity between the captain ownership and what the actual projected chance we have of Kamara being the top player. And I think he's the guy to go to. The other thing, too, is even though we have these really expensive quarterbacks, we have Kamara, who's expensive, Aaron Jones, who's expensive, with Michael Thomas out and with Devontae Adams out, there's a bunch of cheap receivers we could go to. There's a bunch of ways to punt and save money. It's not anything crazy like we had last Sunday where, I mean, we had Rex Burkhead as a smash play at $1,000. There's nothing like that. But, I mean, there's guys that I'm willing to save money with. So, to me, I think that Alvin Kamara is pretty clearly the top spend-up option at captain. Do you feel the same way, or do you prefer Aaron Jones or one of the quarterbacks?
Yeah, our projection for him relative to his captain ownership is comical because I'm not telling you news by saying when Michael Thomas is out, Alvin Kamara is just going to smash. People still don't seem to be internalizing just how easy of a smash he's going to be based on our ownership versus our projection that he is the top scoring player. And even when you adjust it for his high salary, people just are disrespecting his true upside based on Michael Thomas being out. And even when Michael Thomas is out, he's obviously an incredibly talented player as well. So yeah, I think I'm going to be over the field on Alvin Kamara at captain because you probably just should be based on what our ownership projection is for the field. Outside of that, I think Aaron Jones actually falls into that almost a similar-ish tier to me, where when Devontae Adams is out, he's going to serve as his team's pseudo number 1 or 2 receiver. So I think it's probably that I will be lower owned on a lot of the low price plays and the quarterbacks on DraftKings, and I'll be higher than most on the running backs, who I think are just set up to absolutely smash. Alvin Kamara more so than Jones, and their price is essentially the same. It's functionally the same as $400. So it's not like you're gaining a giant salary edge by going to Jones. So I would say Kamara as the clear captain pay-up spot on both, FanDuel and DraftKings. And Jones, I think maybe slept on a little bit into how he falls into that same projection or that same style of player.
Any issue with rostering Alvin Kamara and Aaron Jones together?
I don't think so. And I do think there's some possible negative correlation between running backs and opposing running backs, because generally you do get running backs like Derrick Henry is going to limit his opponents to running a very small amount of plays if he has a good night, because he's going to be chunking off between the tackles, not going out of bounds for the most part, 10, 15, 5, 10-yard plays where you're running clock. Kamara and Jones aren't really those styles of running back necessarily. They can both get there as receivers. I would say Latavius Murray probably falls into a different scenario where if he's getting on the field a lot, they've probably just blown out the Packers, which I don't think is awfully likely, but he is a very specific kind of player where his opponent is probably losing. Alvin Kamara can get there in any facet, as can Aaron Jones. So I think on a different slate, I would be much more hesitant to roster running backs on opposing teams. On this showdown slate, I don't think it's as much a priority to avoid that.
All right. So question in the chat. Somebody asked me, we've got Shane in the chat said to me, so do I just think that Emmanuel Sanders is going to rip off 100 yards against the Packers? No, not really. That's not really what I think is going to happen. It's more just leveraging ownership and what I think is a likely outcome. The other thing too is, I mean, we went over the price tag of Emmanuel Sanders. He's $5,600. He's cheaper than pretty much all the other starting receivers in this game, right? I mean, he's cheaper than Allen Lazard. He's cheaper than MVS. He's cheaper than Jared Cook. He's a lot cheaper than Traquan Smith. If he scores 10 or 11 fantasy points at his price point, that's a decent outcome, right? I think people are way overstating just what he did last week and what you need him to do. Just because you roster somebody, you don't need them to score 1 million fantasy points in a showdown slate. If you get 12, 13 fantasy points for Emmanuel Sanders, I think that's fine. I mean, what do you think the median outcome is for Sanders in this game?
Yeah, it's probably got to look something like at least 3 to 4 catches for 40 or so yards. That's not bad, and that doesn't capture his upside, or that isn't his upside. It does capture it, I guess. It isn't his upside. His upside is actually like a 100-yard game, and we have him it's his price. I think we really hit it. The price is just so cheap relative to being the number 2 receiver in an ambiguous situation. I think Traquan Smith is the number 1 receiver on this team. How confident can I be after seeing one game of that sample? Not confident at all, but the pricing difference should say that it's very we should be very confident. So I think you can absolutely leverage that. And just in terms of a raw point projection, he does project as our best value over $5,000 on DraftKings because his price is so low and he's a starting receiver.
Yeah, I mean, that's how I feel too. It's not like here when I was asked he's going to go over 100 yards. No, probably not. But I also don't think you need him to go over 100 yards, so it's different. If you're rostering Alvin Kamara in the captain spot, yes, you need a massive game from Alvin Kamara at his price point. You don't necessarily need that from Emmanuel Sanders. And I don't think Emmanuel Sanders makes for a particularly good captain play either. In terms of the quarterbacks, how do you feel about them as captains? Would you be willing to roster either of them? Personally, I think that Kamara and Jones both make for better captain plays on DraftKings. On FanDuel, I'd be a little more willing to roster the quarterbacks in the captain spot because there's no the PPR bonus. But on DraftKings, I'm much more looking towards the running backs.
Yeah, FanDuel would kind of favor the Derrick Henry style running back as opposed to the full PPR of DraftKings. And I don't think, there's a non-zero chance that either of these guys could go over 100 yards as a receiver, which doesn't, like, the 100-yard mark specifically has no significance on FanDuel. So I think they have, like, that kind of bonus upside as well. Much more viable. I still would prefer to go with the running backs at captain on FanDuel. Much more viable to go quarterback. On DraftKings, it's not impossible. It's obviously not impossible that either of the quarterbacks end up being the top captain play. And now with both their top receivers out, it actually does make a bit more sense given that we can't project. If Drew Brees goes off, Michael Thomas, without a doubt, has a great game. Now we can't say that with Michael Thomas out. It could be one touchdown to Jared Cook, one touchdown to Emmanuel Sanders, and, he sneaks one in or just throws for a lot of yards. So I think it's not impossible now, specifically with both of the top target hog receivers out, for them to spread the ball around more. It still doesn't give me great confidence. And typically what we see when a quarterback makes the top captain, like makes the captain spot in the optimal lineup, is they have rushing upside. And they typically at least had a few yards on the ground, and they oftentimes punched one in. I can't really see that with either of these guys. Aaron Rodgers has a bit of legs, but he's getting older, and it's certainly not like he has Kyler Murray legs. And Drew Brees obviously has nothing. I think he has like 150 or 15-yard game in his time in New Orleans. Obviously is a zero as a rusher unless he gets a 1-yard sneak. So I would say I'm not typically looking to non-rushing quarterbacks at my captain spot. I think maybe this is a bit of a unique scenario because we're not going to have such concentrated target shares and air yard shares on either team, but I'm still not confident in putting them at captain.
Thanks to Chad for giving me the update on the long DK Metcalf touchdown. That's much appreciated, and looking forward to looking at updated my lineups as we go along here. So then looking at some of the cheaper plays, is there anybody you'd be willing to punt with in the captain? Is there anybody you think makes for a good cheap captain play that you want to do that to maybe? I mean, it might be viable to get a cheap captain and then you just jam them in with Kamara, Jones, Rodgers, and Brees, and you just go really strong stars and scrubs. Is there anybody cheap enough that you'd be willing to do that kind of construction?
I think the cheapest player I would feel confident playing captain would be Emmanuel Sanders. And it's like you said, we're not confident that he goes for 100 yards, but we can reasonably say he's a number 2 starting receiver on a Drew Brees offense, and he's so cheap. And it does let you go like stars and scrubs, essentially playing a bunch of, awesome, sick players in Alvin Kamara, in Aaron Jones. It lets you comfortably get those guys in. And this is a slate where there are at least 2 studs that I'm trying to jam into every lineup in those 2 running backs. Because like I said, I kind of think Jones falls closer to Alvin Kamara in terms of this role than people expect. So I think Emmanuel Sanders is as low as I would go. Looking at previous winning lineups, you typically don't get like crazy low punt plays. I'm not projecting Deontay Harris to ever really make the top captain spot, despite the fact that he does project as quite a good value. It typically is just that these guys aren't going to go for crazy good games, and you do need someone who puts up a lot of points on most slates. There's almost always going to be someone who puts up, a 20 to 25 point game. You typically need that player in your captain spot, even if you can get 2 15s by, punting for Deontay Harris and captain. It's typically not enough that you can get a handful of good, not great players in, and you can get a handful of good but not great captain spots in. So Emmanuel Sanders, I think on this slate is the lowest I would go. And that's probably even lower than I usually would go, but he's quite cheap.
All right, somebody in chat, R. Stanley, asked me who is going to be the most owned captain. I'm pretty confident saying it's going to be Alvin Kamara. He's coming off a really big game in a primetime spot. Everybody knows Michael Thomas is out. There's extra target shares to go around. And there's also not really a big price difference between him and the other top guys. I think that people are going to be, pretty willing to throw Alvin Kamara for minimal price difference on DraftKings into the captain spot. 400 more than Aaron Jones, 800 more than Aaron Rodgers. I think it's going to be the same for FanDuel also. It's not going to be quite the same ownership that he has on DK, but still I think Kamara is going to be the highest owned captain play. And I don't mind it still. I still think that even despite the ownership, go with him. We have him projected his chances of being the top scorer in the game so far above what his ownership is going to be in the captain spot. Don't mind it. Don't care about the ownership in this spot. It's still not high enough. One final question before we get off the captain talk / MVP. If you had to roster one wideout to be in the captain / MVP spot on FanDuel DraftKings, which one do you think is the most upside? I have one guy in my mind. I'm curious if it's the same for you.
I'll go with one, and I'll go with Traquan Smith. For me, I think he probably has one of the highest upsides out of all these players, although Marquez Valdes-Scantling, I think, basically falls into that same range, and he's cheaper. So actually, maybe the right answer is probably Marquez Valdes-Scantling. And given what we've seen from Drew Brees, maybe you don't want to attach yourself to the number one, or at least you don't want to captain that guy. MVS also has like a really deep, actually both receivers last week had quite a deep ADOT as well. So on a per target basis, he's capturing a lot of upside on each individual deep shot. So maybe Marquez Valdes-Scantling is actually where I'm going to go with if I have a cheap captain play or a wide receiver cheap captain play to be specific.
Yeah, so it's MVS for me also, just because he's a guy we've seen break off so many big plays over the last couple of years. Now, he's also one of the lower floor receivers in this game, I think, also, because if MVS doesn't break off that 60-yard touchdown or, that long 70-yard play, he's just going to bust, because that's what we see from him all the time. He's a guy ran a really fast 40 time, like you said, a ton of air yards. A lot of his passes tend to be downfield. If he doesn't catch one of those long plays, then it's just going to be a bad game for him. But that kind of upside is what I'm looking for a lot of times on a one-game slate. So MVP/captain, if I'm going off the board with somebody who's going to be, cheaper and is sub 5% owned, I think MVS is the way to go. There's a lot of upside there.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm going to pivot off Traquan Smith. Not that I think he's a bad play, but I think the best upside play would probably end up being Marquez Valdes-Scantling, especially, like you said, I don't think his floor is great because so many of his targets are downfield that a lot of variance can go into them. It would not be surprising to see him catch one, middling deep ball, and that's it. And that's not enough to be the right captain. But if he catches 3 or 4 of them, then it's an absolute smash. So I'm gonna say more confidently, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, the best cheap wide receiver player, reasonably cheap.
Thank you, Jordan, for the super chat. I see that you're donating money towards my Tyler Hero fund. As everybody knows, I want to get. Actually, I want to get a Tyler Hero fathead to put over my bet to get over my. I don't know if they're still in business. Remember fatheads? They used to be commercials on them all the time. That was on every Sunday in between every single drive. We got a fathead commercial. I haven't seen one of those.
They still have to be in business. Everyone loves fatheads.
They used to have a lot of commercials. I've never met one person who actually had a fathead at their house. So that would be something that I think goes against the fathead. Is I've seen them commercialized a lot and never actually seen them in the wild. Another question that we have here, which I think is interesting. Can you fade both of the QBs? I'm going to answer this first, and I'll get your take on it. I think that's perfectly reasonable for a couple of reasons. Most of all, because we have 2 really good running back plays. So not only is there a situation where you could fade the quarterbacks, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is my favorite strategy for the slate, but there's a very easy path to victory for it, where if Alvin Kamara plays well, if Aaron Jones plays well, both well within the realm of possibility, it stands to reason if those guys are scoring touchdowns, then there's not going to be as many passing touchdowns. That's just the way it works. So I think that if you're not playing the quarterbacks, I assume you're playing Aaron Jones and Alvin Kamara, and I'm fine with that lineup construction. Do you feel any differently?
Yeah, you can definitely fade them, especially just like on an individual lineup. I wouldn't say on my entire portfolio I wouldn't want to have none of them. But on an individual lineup level, it's absolutely possible that, like you said, that we see, even like when you look deeper to guys like Jamal Williams or Latavius Murray, these are both guys who I actually think are pretty solid plays at their price points. They could punch in, either of them could punch in a touchdown. And you really need like a multi-touchdown game from either of these quarterbacks. When you look at the total right now, you do need a good game, not just a middling game. You need a decent fantasy outing. That could easily be soaked up or could be consumed by Aaron Jones and Alvin Kamara touchdowns. I don't think you need to go super low on them on your entire, if you're building 150 or even 20, I don't think you need to go super low on them, but it's fine to have 1 or 2 lineups that have neither, because it's very possible that's just the way the slate breaks.
So somebody else in here asked about defenses, and just because it came up, I think we could talk about overall defense, something that we talked about last week also, but I'm not narcissistic enough to assume that people know every word I've ever said, because or else I would have way more followers on social media if people actually clung to every word that I ever said on a show. For me, defenses in Showdown, I don't tend to roster them all that much. I think there are situations where they're viable. However, it's not all that often, and it usually has to be a really low-scoring game. I don't think this is going to be a low-scoring game between the Packers and the Saints. And then the funny thing, too, is if you remember last week, anybody remembers the way the Patriots game started last week, a pick 6. They brought it back for a touchdown. Everybody's complaining on social media. Showdown's over. Patriots defense ruined Showdown. Slate over. Like, turn the game off if you didn't roster the Pats in the captain spot or whatever. And then the game goes on. There's a million points scored, and they don't factor into the top lineups at all. So even in the situation where the Patriots defense got a pick six and scored a touchdown to open up the game, they didn't really factor into the slate all that much. It takes a lot for a defense to actually end up in the optimal lineup because there's just not nearly as much upside in defense as there are on other positions on the slate, right? I mean, if Emmanuel Sanders, who some people are skeptical of, he has 5 catches for 60 yards. He scores 11 fantasy points. It's pretty unlikely that any of the defenses match that. And it's not like they're that much cheaper than him. There's some salary savings, but nothing ridiculous. It's just so rare that we see a defense sneak into the optimal lineup in one of these contests. And especially in this particular matchup, it's not good for the defenses. So what's your overall take on defenses in Showdown?
Yeah, I would say defenses I'm generally lower on. We talked about this last week, and I kind of fall in line with you on that. I'm generally lower on defenses. Their upside is quite minimal. And one, in a game environment like this where the total opened at like 51, I'm not sure where it landed at as we're about to come up to lock, but that's not awfully a great environment because defenses generally aren't scoring touchdowns. In quite a low-scoring game where none of the top options are really smashing, you could get me more on board with defenses, but also the quarterbacks in this game are like the antithesis of games you would want to play defenses in. In like the Jacksonville Thursday night football game, I think either of those defenses, even though the total was a bit higher than you would expect for a game like that, either of those defenses made sense because you can see, a second year, what was he, like a 5th or 6th round quarterback like Gardner Minshew making a bunch of mistakes. Ryan Fitzpatrick is literally known for how bad his lows are. This is the opposite of that with Drew Brees and Aaron Rodgers. Neither of them throw interceptions. Like they're like 2 of the league leaders in interception rate in terms of how low they are year in, year out. Neither of them are like sack monsters either, taking a ton of sacks like a guy like Kyler Murray, Deshaun Watson are. This is, I would say, one of the lesser slates to play defense on. The total's not good, and neither of the quarterbacks are anywhere close to like mistake-prone quarterbacks that we typically want our defenses to be facing.
All right, yeah, kind of jumping around a little bit because I'm just answering the questions. We've got an hour to fill to talk about a one-game showdown slate, so I've kind of gotten off track a little bit here. In terms of the tight ends here, I think one of the only players who has some upside that we haven't really talked about on the Saints, I know you mentioned him quickly, but Jared Cook, who kind of interesting. I think that he's somebody who could have a really big game without Michael Thomas there. I think that he's somebody who there is a little bit of familiarity there with Drew Brees. We've seen him have games where he gets double-digit targets. Hasn't really been the case for him so far this year. I think this could be a good spot for Jared Cook, though. How do you feel about him?
Yeah, Jared Cook is top 10 among tight ends in air yards, 124 yards. Pretty solid in terms of he runs deep. Now without Michael Thomas, he's going to be running deep and getting targeted more often. And although like every situation is subject to change, I would say generally he's probably just going to be doing that, but at a larger frequency because generally we do see players' ADOTs are held constant. It's their like target volume that shifts. So for me, that just means he's going to get more targets at a similar, not like crazy deep. He's still a tight end. But if he's going to have like a solid tight end ADOT, sitting somewhere around 10 and he gets a handful of targets there, that gives him at least more upside than I think you would be cognizant of for most tight ends. I'm not sure if I'm looking to him at captain. I almost got like eviscerated because I said I didn't want to play Darren Waller at captain because I didn't like tight ends generally aren't the optimal captain. And if he didn't happen to face Alvin Kamara that slate, I would have eaten my words so hard. Luckily, Alvin Kamara kind of saved me. But I do think there are scenarios where I think if a tight end is going to get a ton of work, that's really where you consider them a captain. The only captain tight ends we've seen be successful in last year was George Kittle and Travis Kelce. I think Travis Kelce's within the playoffs. George Kittle's in the middle of the year. You need a ton of targets to be the captain. Wide receivers do that. Tight ends generally don't. Maybe this is a scenario where you could say that script is flipped, where this tight end actually could get a ton of targets. I'm not sure I feel confident in that, so I think he's a good flex play. Doubt I'm getting up too much of him in captain.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I think Cook's a good play. I mean, compare him to some of the other guys in the mid-range. I prefer the Packers receivers who are a little bit cheaper to Jared Cook, but I do think he's viable. I hate to do this, but guys, we've got about 400 people watching, not that many likes. Hit the like button, help us out. It helps us in the YouTube algorithm, which I don't understand how the YouTube algorithm works because I'm an idiot. I just know that I'm supposed to ask for likes every once in a while because it helps us. It helps more people find our YouTube channel. And while you're there, also subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so that when we are going live to do shows, you guys are aware of it. And then you can come check out and you could, watch us or argue about whatever silly stuff it is you want to argue about in the chat, because that also seems to be a fun activity for a lot of people who watch the shows. Not only are you watching us, you're watching the chat, you're yelling at people about whatever their dumb opinions are, but it's good. That's all part of the fun. Also, if anybody has questions, throw them in the chat because we'll catch those also. Ray Bynum just asked Alvin Kamara or Aaron Jones. we talked about this a little bit before. I think Alvin Kamara is just by far the top high-end guy to pay up for on the slate. We have him projected way above everybody else here. I think that he makes for a great option. Brian Huddleston asks, who is Green Bay's primary slot receiver with Adams out? I'm going to assume it's going to be Alan Lazard. Would you say the same?
Yeah, I would imagine that's where they would want to get him involved, mostly because Marquez Valdes-Scantling kind of plays the opposite of a slot release, just a burner. Whereas Alan Lazard also did have like a very solid ADOT last week. But if there was anyone you were going to be putting in there, you would get Lazard in there. Robert Tonyan could play some snaps in the slot. He's got 50 snaps at tight end this season to 43 for every other tight end on the Packers roster. So he's a guy who I think he's only 2,200 is quite cheap for a player who's going to be playing a majority of the snaps for the Packers at tight end. I know Rodgers hasn't typically used tight ends. That's because he never had a talented tight end like Robert Tonyan before.
So some people have asked about the Packers tight ends overall. I know that overall, so people were asking earlier about Jared Cook and just tight end. So we could tie this in together because you just mentioned Tonyan here. How do you feel about him, and would you be willing to roster him? Do you have any interest in Jay Sternberger maybe, who the Packers use a lot of draft capital on, but for whatever reason don't really seem to use him? And which that always is so weird to me when a team invests a lot in free agency or a lot of draft capital in a player and they just don't really roster him, use him during games. It's like, what was the point? So if I was going to say roster Sternberger be under the thing of hey, they spent a lot of draft capital on him, I would think that they did that for a reason. So far, that seems to be not the case. How do you feel about Tonyan? Because I know you mentioned him.
Yeah, I actually think Tonyan at his price is quite a good play. 2,200 for essentially starting tight end is quite cheap. He's certainly not the starting tight end level of Jared Cook or other awesome tight ends. But if he's going to be on the field for a majority of snaps and he's only 2,200, there are certainly worse punt plays you could make. I'll probably be over the field on him. Not going to be crazy hard. I can't find myself to be interested in Jay Sternberg. I don't think he's got a catch on the season. Doesn't seem like you said, it just doesn't seem like they want to get him involved despite investing in him. Another guy they invested in, Josiah Deguara, is basically an H-back, but he's also out tonight. Not that it would make a huge difference because, like I said, Tonyan clearly the starting tight end, but maybe that's your reasoning for getting Sternberger on the field. But I would just why not just play Robert Tonyan then? It's not like Robert Tonyan is going to be uber chalk, and it's not like he's crazy expensive. Same thing why not just pivot to Deontay Harris or whatever? Not like he's going to be crazy chalk, but he does project to have a solid role. Whereas Sternberger in that same cheap price range, just I don't think gives you any advantage over those guys, but certainly gives you the downside of being a zero because that's what he's been.
Yeah, somebody just asked, Jannar in the chat asked, Robert Tonyan captain. I think he might have just been saying that he think Robert Tonyan's a good captain play. That's a little much for me. I think Tonyan could sneak his way into maybe double-digit fantasy points, and for his price point, that's a pretty good outcome on DraftKings or FanDuel, but that's steep if you're playing him at captain. There's just not that much upside there, because just think, realistically, if you're playing him in the 1.5x spot, you need him to outscore guys like Alvin Kamara. You need him to outscore guys like Aaron Jones more often than not. And to me, that's just not a realistic outcome. There really aren't a whole lot of slates where I think you want to go that ridiculously off the wall with a punt play. Maybe there's certain slates where, a guy like MVS, right? There's some slates where he's, 4,600 or something like that. He's an upside guy that I think you'd consider playing at the captain spot. I don't really see that from Tonyan. I mean, what do you need? You need the Mike Evans game from where he catches 2 1-yard touchdown passes. That's where he gets the upside. That's just not really something I want to bank on. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, even if he did catch the 2 1-yard touchdown passes, but sure, it's possible. Aaron Rodgers throws a lot of touchdowns and they could land on his tight end's hands. Alvin Kamara probably still beats just really goes off. And same with Aaron Jones. What are the odds that both of those guys are good enough that you want to get them in flex, but not good enough that you have to have them in captain? So Robert Tonyan is the only way to get them there. That seems like the smallest Venn diagram you could possibly find. I'd much rather just pay up for reasonable guys at captain.
All right. So somebody else who got brought up in the chat, and I actually do think he's a really interesting play, Jamal Williams. So here's the deal with Jamal Williams for me. Aaron Jones is going to have a lot of ownership for good reason. He had a monster game last week. I think that he's probably the second best overall play in this game behind Alvin Kamara. But if you know anything about the Packers and their running back usage over the last few years, just because Aaron Jones played well last week does not mean Aaron Jones plays well next week. It does not mean Aaron Jones plays well this week. There's so little consistency with how the Packers handle the running back situation, no matter who the head coach is. Aaron Jones should have been the workhorse back there for the last couple of years. It just hasn't been the case so far. So I think if you want to fade Aaron Jones in a lineup or two and play Jamal Williams, I think that's perfectly reasonable because the running back situation of the Packers is so volatile that if you want a creative way to gain leverage and be contrarian, I think making lineups with Jamal Williams instead of Aaron Jones makes sense. It's not necessarily what I think is the best play on paper, but I think that it's really hard to apply logic with the Packers and how they handle their running backs a lot of the time.
Yeah, I agree. Jamal Williams very clearly still operating as their number 2 running back despite having A.J. Dillon. I think A.J. Dillon saw a handful of carries last week. It was when the game was well out of hand. He's second on the team in running back targets, Jamal Williams is, and he's second on the team in running back carries. He's going to be not awfully involved, but involved enough that like his median projection makes him look like a solid value at that 2K price tag. The price is so cheap. He deserves to be, I would say, somewhere in that like 3.5 to 4 range where you actually have to consider your opportunity cost. The opportunity costs are quite low. It is guys like, Robert Tonyan. It's not guys like Emmanuel Sanders. So because of that price tag and the fact that we know he is the 1B, and we've seen the Packers in the past, despite Aaron Jones' greatness, just de-gap and put Jamal Williams in. Yeah, you can definitely play Jamal Williams. I also, just because he's cheap, I think if he was more expensive, I wouldn't be as inclined to do this. But I think you could run double running back. That's something that hits at a solid enough rate, especially because Jamal Williams is so cheap. And it could be another way to get contrarian. And, it doesn't cost you a lot. You're trading off Robert Tonyan's for Jamal Williams. So it's very possible that Williams breaks one long one and scores. And then he has to be, like, he is in the optimal at that point.
Yeah, I mean, they're both really cheap where it makes sense. Eddie Del Toro in the chat says, I look like Justin Timberlake with glasses. I could be Justin Timberlake's nerdy little brother. By the way, about the glasses situation for me, and number one, I get compared to Justin Timberlake all the time. I used to do the DraftKings, the Madden Sims, and I would do play-by-plays for that. And I was telling some Tinder stories at the time, and I did get the name Justin Timberlake at the time, which I thought was a really good nickname. The other thing also with the glasses, so I'm such an idiot. I usually wear contacts. That's why I don't typically wear glasses. And I thought I had contacts left because I had a box left sitting on my counter, and there was nothing in it. So the entire time I'm sitting there like, oh, is it time for me to order contacts? And they're just empty. But because I'm just such a lazy idiot, I just left them there for a month and assumed I had contacts left, but I actually didn't. So now I just can't see anything. There was actually a point in time before we were doing the show where Jordan was messaging me to jump on, and I was looking for my glasses and I couldn't find them because I wasn't wearing my glasses, which is always kind of a weird conundrum to get in because I can't see anything. I need to see, and then I can't because I'm not wearing my glasses. But all right, got a little far off there just because somebody called me Justin Timberlake, but not the worst celebrity to get compared to either.
I'm quite jealous of that when you're like, yeah, I get compared to Justin Timberlake, like only one of like the most notable people for how good looking they are. And I can't do contacts. I don't want to put things touching my eyeballs.
All right. Somebody asked about the kickers. Do you have any kicker takes for this game? I'm generally neutral on kickers. If they fit into a lineup and you need the salary savings, go ahead, roster them. I think there's enough value. You don't have to go to the kickers in this game. They're usually high floor, low ceiling plays. You could plug them in, save some salary. They're not going to end up being optimal all that often unless it's a game where it's, 17-14 and kind of a defensive battle. Not how I project this game to go. How do you feel about kickers overall? And are there either of them that you really prefer in this game?
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much summed it up perfectly. If they fit in, I don't think they're bad plays. And there are slates where a guy who just has a good floor game is certainly enough to get into the optimal lineup. So it's not a bad thing to play a kicker just because, your whole lineup doesn't have to hit a crazy ceiling if the game specifically doesn't call for that. That does typically mean it's a lower scoring game. Not always, but typically when you see a kicker make the optimal lineup, it's because not a ton of players go off. That typically means not a lot of scoring. So I would say if you're betting the under, or if you're just building a lineup based on the premise that the under hits, you don't even have to be betting it. You could just want to be like contrarian. It's just a different way to build a lineup, is thinking what happens when this game, sits at just 45 points or something. So it's a way to get contrarian, and kicker would generally fall into that build. Not too excited. Mason Crosby leads the NFL in points, but he's also done it early. He's top 5 in points, so on kicker specifically, to be clear. He's top 5 in points, but he's also done it because they've scored a ton of touchdowns. So it seems like his upside essentially comes when all the other players hit their upside, which is just like, an amalgamation of kickers. That's how they work. If a team scores a ton of points, they'll be good, but they still won't be good enough. So don't really care too much about kickers. If they fit, it's fine.
Do you have any opinions on Taysom Hill? He's won quite a few showdown slates randomly over the last couple of years where all of a sudden it's like, hey, Taysom Hill throws a 50-yard pass and then he catches a 1-yard touchdown, or Taysom Hill runs in a 3-yard touchdown. He's somebody who, and by the way, maybe this is just me because it gets more magnified. This only seems to happen on showdown slates where all of a sudden Taysom Hill is involved and vultures a touchdown and ends up just being a huge nuisance for tournaments. I know that there's some people who really like to roster Taysom Hill in these contests. I can't do it. I don't think he makes for a particularly great play. We have him with a 0.4% chance to end up as a top 6% player in this game. That's very low odds. Total dart throw, not one that I'm usually willing to make. Do you feel differently about Taysom Hill?
Yeah, I don't hate Taysom Hill. I don't mind getting him into lineups because he does have some upside. Like, we've seen him score a ton of touchdowns, which is certainly some variance. Like, players can't score touchdowns at a crazy high rate, but it also could be. I think it's not unreal to think that it's possible the way he gets used is unique enough that he'll score at a above average league rate, and he could sustain that over like a decent enough sample. His price is super cheap, $1,800. Basically, anyone who has touchdown upside at that low of a price, I think you have to consider. I would still say in the same price range, I'd rather have Robert Tonyan, I think, for just a little bit more, or right in the same price range too. It's like 2020, 200-ish. Jamal Williams, a better play around there. And even like a little more Latavius Murray, all guys I would prioritize over Taysom Hill. But I don't think Taysom Hill is like a bad play just because we don't know what he is. It's weird, but I do think he has some touchdown upside. Not my favorite punt play, though. Probably like my fourth favorite punt play.
All right, quick ad read. Let's pay some bills here. Guys, we have a new package deal on Awesemo.com. It's called the Express Pass. So if you're interested in signing up for Awesemo.com, maybe you don't want to commit to a full year's deal, try out the Express Pass. It's only $3.95 a week. So you get a week, try it out, see what you like up on the site. It comes with access to our Showdown single game player projections, ownership projections, top plays tool. And this comes in addition to player rankings, lineup builder light, ownership rankings, top stacks express tool. It's a really good value for $3.95. And I also think it's a really good way to just dip your toes into Awesemo.com. So if it's a thing where you've been considering trying out a DFS site and you don't want to really make a long-term commitment, try it out for a week. It's only $3.95. And hey, maybe ship a GPP in that week, and then you know that it's definitely worth your while, and use that money to get a full membership. So I think it's something you try out. You're probably going to like it, and then you want to re-up with Awesemo for the rest of the year. So try that out if you've had any interest in joining us at Awesemo.com. $3.95, really cheap. You don't have to make all that much of an investment. I think it's worth trying out. And if you have any questions about it, you could always message me on Twitter, join the premium Slack chat. Also, when you're a member, ask any of us questions. A lot of us are available in there. Good way to test out some of the features. All right, so moving on, let's get to some of the value plays in this contest. I think there's a lot of them that are viable. We've hit on a bunch of them so far. Jamal Williams, you brought up Robert Tonyan. I think he makes sense. Deontay Harris, who we haven't really talked about, his name's come up. I think that he makes for a pretty solid value option. He has a chance to play snaps and get some targets. How do you feel about Deontay Harris?
Yeah, Deontay Harris, I think, was either second or third on the team in wide receiver snaps last week. Like, he was clearly their number 3 receiver because they don't have a ton of depth. They don't want, like, Taysom Hill just doesn't actually play a full-time receiver role. He's just this gadget player. So he really is the number 3 receiver. He's probably the best punt play when you're looking at guys under say, 3K, because he has the most impactful role. He's a guy who can actually get on the field for a significant amount of snaps. He's not buried behind Aaron Jones, who could and does project to go out and take the bulk of the work. He is, like, not an every snap player, but he can be an every snap that is a 3 receiver snap for the Saints. So I would say he's probably one of the better, if not the best, punt play. I think Jamal Williams is right up there with him, though. Other, like, guys you could consider would be like A.J. Dillon, who got a handful of carries in garbage time last week. I don't expect there to be much garbage time this week, and he clearly has no upside as a pass catcher. He just hardly has any upside. He's a guy who they probably just want to get in reps because the game didn't matter at that point. Outside of that, like Josh Hill, you could punt at tight end, but again, I feel so much better about, like, pay, $1,000 more to get up to Deontay Harris. I would absolutely be doing that. Any interest in you in, like, Tyler Ervin? Because he's a guy who actually does seem to be like Jamal Williams is to Aaron Jones as Tyler Ervin is to Jamal Williams. He just does that same thing, but less.
Yeah, he's not really somebody that I got to, nor did I consider. I mean, any of these guys that are, 1,000 or whatever around that price range, I don't really think you could go wrong with them. We have him projected for a 3.3% chance to end up in the top 6 lineup, which isn't bad for his price point. I think that he's okay. I think that Malik Taylor is also pretty interesting at $200. If I was going to go to somebody who was like that minimum price, like the $200, $400, $800 range, I go to Malik Taylor, and I think that he makes for a little bit better of a value before Tyler Ervin. And if you have Taylor in the lineup, you kind of have free reign to roster whoever else you want with him. Let's see, other cheap guys are in here. Not to get off too far on this, but also another one, A.J. Dillon. Why did the Packers spend draft capital on him? And then
Dude, the Packers are so bad.
like it's just such an odd draft pick to take a high pick on. It was, I mean, he showed up, he had really big quads, and they're like, yeah, we want this guy. And then they're like, all right, he doesn't play for us, but he's got really big quads and he deadlifts a lot or something like that. And it's
They drafted a model.
I don't understand what the point of him was. And the funny thing was his yearly draft stock, when those pictures came out of him, remember there was the practice where somebody took the sideline photo of him with just gigantic quads. And then all of a sudden I'm in best ball drafts and he's going like the 7th round. I'm like, well, people are drafting this guy because he's got big legs. And it had nothing to do with how much he was going to produce on the field. That was also a very odd draft pick. Let's see. Got a question here. MVS or Lazard? I think MVS is more upside. I think that Lazard is probably a little bit safer of a play. We talked before that we expect Lazard's going to get most of the snaps out of the slot for the Packers. That's fine. I think both of them are in play. They're actually probably my 2 favorite receivers per dollar with Devontae Adams out. Just for me, I'm always chasing upside in the one-game slate. I also said if I was going to roster one wideout in the captain/MVP spot, it would be MVS for me because I think he's the most likely one to break the slate with a long touchdown. Just because of that upside, I like MVS more than Lazard. I don't think I asked you that earlier. Which of the two do you prefer?
Yeah, I don't think we compared them straight up versus each other. I would say Marquez Valdes-Scantling too, specifically because he's like the same. He's essentially the same price. $600 isn't going like if that somehow gets you a significantly better player, that $600 drop, sure. But I don't think I've had any scenario where I think you really need all the dollars on the slate. You never really do. You're not trying to spend every single dollar because that's going to get you a dupe lineup. So for me, Marquez Valdes-Scantling running deeper, playing on the outside, probably has more upside. And yeah, I'm shooting for first, assuming I'm playing in GPP. So I'm always shooting for first because that's where the equity is. Building lineups that you think can take it all down. So MVS.
All right. If anybody has questions, get those in. We've got about 10 minutes until lock. We've got a bunch of questions about Harris. I think that he's a really good value play. We talked on him a little bit before. Let's see. Who have we not talked about yet?
We've got 2 minutes till lock. 2 minutes.
Oh, 2 minutes. Never mind. I thought it was 8:30.
Yep.
All right, never mind. I don't know what time it is. Look, the time really flew by. I was looking at this before. I was like, how are we going to fill an hour talking about a one-game slate? I thought I was, I made a dumb booger joke at the top. I was like, I thought that was all the material I had. And now here we are. Look at us an hour later. Who would have thought it?
Well, the booger joke worked. It got us there.
So I guess the only player we haven't talked about so far in this contest, and once again, any questions you guys have before we wrap up, Latavius Murray, 2,800. Any interest in him as a pivot play off of Alvin Kamara?
Yeah, I don't hate Murray. He definitely has some upside if they either get to a lead or he just happens to punch one in. I don't think I want to pivot off Alvin Kamara is the problem, though. I think I'd much rather, I love both Alvin Kamara and Aaron Jones. If I'm pivoting off one, it would be Aaron Jones. So I just don't really see the need to leverage Alvin Kamara. I'm going to be over the field on Alvin Kamara anyways.
All right. This is bringing us right to lock here. Any final thoughts before we sign off here?
No, let's just go Alvin Kamara. It sounds like you and I are both going to be over the field on him because Awesemo is going to be over the field on him. He's projected to absolutely smash. That people don't respect Alvin Kamara enough as they should. So let's get it with Alvin Kamara.
Yeah, let's go Alvin Kamara. Big ups to big quads. All of our big booty friends out there. Jordan, play the music. We are out for the night.